Welcome to October and to yet another President's Challenge. Now this month, I have to say, was a real doozy. For October, the challenge is purely sculptural. Turn a piece with no real or perceived practical function. Now I have to say, I spent quite a few hours Googling different terms to try to find some kind of topic for this President's Challenge, and that would also be appropriate for the video. And I came up pretty much empty. Now while I was searching, I came across a website of a turner named David Reed Smith, and I was only on there for a few moments and I realized I had been on his site before, because he has this method that he uses to turn perfect spheres, where he uses a light above his lathe to cast a shadow across his work onto a platform. And on the platform he'll have a circle template, and he'll simply just cut away the shadow, and you can get a sphere, an accurate sphere, fairly quickly that way. And he also uses these spheres to make some interesting sculptural kind of work. But I couldn't very well just copy his work. That would have been okay if I was just doing the President's Challenge, but I can't really steal his work and put it into my own video and not add anything extra, at least add some kind of value to it. So I thought, could I use that same technique of casting the shadow with the work onto a template to make some kind of more complicated form, say a human form or maybe a human silhouette? So that's what I set out to do. So I found it was easy enough to find some human silhouettes online. So I put that as my template on the platform and casted a shadow, and I just basically cut to that profile. And what I found though, when I used the whole cylinder, for some reason, even though this is spot on that silhouette, something happens in the translation, because perhaps it has something to do with having gone from something 3 dimensions, flatten it out into a silhouette, and then trying to bring it back into 3 dimensions in terms of cylinders just never worked out. Even though this is pretty close to that silhouette, every time I did it, instead of looking like a woman, this is clearly a woman's silhouette, it always comes out looking like an old man in a sombrero. So that didn't really work out. So then I thought maybe there's some way I could do some multi-axis, or maybe I can use my therming jig again. But what I found was there's so little wood present, there's so much air being cut, you're cutting so much air, that there's not enough of a shadow being cast onto the template. It's too hard to see it. Even though I tried that a couple of times, those didn't really pan out either. So what ended up working ultimately was just to take a regular old piece of 4/4 stock, usually about 3/4 of an inch thick, and mark the center on both ends and mount that straight on the lathe and cut my profile into that. Alright, I have a little light here that's casting a nice beam on my work. I tried several flashlights and they didn't give a nice straight beam, so I wasn't getting a nice crisp shadow, and I finally found this one, which is a desk lamp that I swiped from my son's room, or should I say borrowed. That's giving me a nice straight beam. And I built a little platform that I've clamped to my lathe bed, made out of 3/4 MDF and some 1/4 inch white melamine that I had lying around, and I kind of like the white surface on top. All very temporary at this point, because I'm just sort of experimenting with this technique. If it pans out and it works out really well, I might try to come up with a platform and a light setup that's a little bit more permanent. But for now, this is going to do. And I have my piece of wood mounted between centers, centered on each end, so it's more or less symmetrical. And I have a female profile here I'm going to do, and I'm going to put just the front side of the profile into the wood. And what's going to happen is I'm going to get that profile on both sides of the work. So one thing I considered is that I may, since I have 2 profiles, one on each side, I may want to split it down the middle and separate it and use it that way. So I want to make sure I have a little bit of extra room on each end, so that I have some surface that I can register against my table saw, so I can split it in half. And this template is going to go right onto the platform, and I'm going to tweak. What I do is I tweak the wood a little bit just so the shadow is minimal right there. And I'm going to line up the front edge of my template against that shadow line and just tape it down with some masking tape. And I got to make sure, oops, I'm more or less centered with the wood as well. I have my tool rest set just a little, slightly below center. I'm going to use the gouge, and I want the gouge to be just slightly above center line. Usually I might use it a little bit higher, but I'm going to cut just above center line with the gouge. You can see as I start to cut into the wood, you can see the tip of the gouge. And I'm basically just going to cut away the shadow as close as I can to the template. You can see that the shadow is a little bit light because it is only two sides of the 4/4 stock passing at a time. When I was doing multi-axis, it was even half this. It was only about half that darkness. So you can imagine that would be pretty hard to work with. But as you can see, you can also kind of use the shadow of the tool itself. Now it's shaping up pretty good, but because I was using the gouge slightly above center line, what happens is the shadow of the tool will reach the template before when there's still a little bit of a margin left. And you can see, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but now that I turn the work parallel to the platform, you can see there are still a little bit of shadows on there, and that works out well because. And that's because the tool was slightly above center, but that works out well because I want to try to clean up or refine the shape a little bit with a scraper. So what I'm going to do is I tried several different scrapers. Scraper would be ideal for this kind of work because they take off very little material. And I tried several different ones, and the one I found that seemed to work is called a wedge tool. It's basically just a round stock, high-speed steel. This one's 1/8 inch. You could probably use 1/4 inch as well. And you basically just grind a bevel on one side. The only thing is when you grind the bevel, the burr is in the wrong direction, so the tool wants to be used upside down. But I prefer to use the tool with the bevel up. And so what I'll do is after I run in the grinder is I'll take a diamond hone and I'll push a burr back out the other way. And you should be able to feel a little bit of a burr right on the end there. If you don't have a wedge tool, or if you can't make a wedge tool like this, you can also try using a skew on its side as a negative rake scraper, or whatever small scrapers you can come up with that you can do detail work with if you happen to know how to use and have a point tool that gets into certain spots that are really tight, or whatever you, like I said, any kind of old tool that you have, you can reground and use a scraper. Can do the trick here. Now I want to make sure this time that the point where I'm cutting on is dead center because I want to be able to take away the rest of that shadow. I want it so that when the tool touches the shadow, that's also that takes away the rest of the shadow. Now this tool is a scraping tool, but it's kind of interesting because it has a bevel. When I'm cutting at the tip, it's kind of like a negative rake scraper. Which I haven't gone, that's the topic of my next video, so I haven't really gone over yet, but basically you have a bevel going down when you're cutting. But when I'm cutting on the side of this tool, because the burr is at an angle, to the oncoming wood, that's shear scraping. You can also shear scrape with a tip by rotating it, but you have to be careful because what it'll do is it'll tend to want to run back. So you can get a little bit nicer finish by doing that, but you have to be careful. Don't try to go backwards with it. Always make sure you're going forwards with it. I've gotten a couple little catches, and when you have so much little detail right here, you have to be really careful doing that. And I'm just going to try to refine and now it's looking pretty nice. The nice profile. Now got the detail in the mouth and the nose, and so at this point I'm going to stop looking at the template. And I'm just going to see if I can refine just by looking at the profile, and see if I can just smooth it out just a little bit more. Any little undulations. And there it is, profile on two sides of the work. All right, there she is. It actually looks like a female profile this time. So I'm glad I left these little flats on there, because I did decide to split them in half, because I had some practical ideas of how you could actually use this. But since this President's Challenge is supposed to be not practical, what I ended up doing is, turns out they have a pregnant version of this silhouette. So I did one with pregnant. It was two-sided pregnant, and I split them in half and I put them together. One side is not pregnant, the other side is pregnant, and I called it a half-pregnant silhouette. And along with a nonsense story about doing this 9 months apart, I got a pretty good laugh at the club the other night. Even though this was all this technique came up to do something impractical, I started seeing all kinds of practical applications, especially when you can split them apart like this. You can use these very similar to the way you use a split turning. Imagine these being the styles on a clock or a mirror, a small mirror or something like that. Not necessarily, possibly with a human profile, but not necessarily. It could be any kind of profile that would look nice to border on either side of a mirror or a clock. Now, the other thing that happened just by coincidence, a good friend of mine, Todd Clippinger up in Montana, has a project he's doing for a restaurant out of some reclaimed wood, and he called me up and asked me how hard would it be to do beer taps on the lathe. And I realized these very techniques, the shadowing and the using a flat piece of wood, 4/4 wood, was absolutely perfect for what he wanted to do. And so this is a really good technique if you ever needed to make beer taps. It was very easy to make several different kinds. As well, you don't necessarily have to do a full template for these. You might just do a partial template for the parts that are really difficult. You can also, since you might want to make several of these, you can always freehand the first one and then put a piece of paper on the platform and trace this out and use that to duplicate to make multiples of these very close, as close to identical as possible. So you never know when you start to look at the techniques for something you really don't want to do, where you might end up with something that's actually quite useful, and I can keep it in my toolbox now. Who knows when something else might come up, I might be able to use these techniques again. So until next time, that's what I have for you for this President's Challenge. Until then, get out in your shop and make some shavings.